Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, which is the third in our countdown to heat net regulations. Today's webinar is looking at the technical standards for residential landlords. Just some quick housekeeping before we begin. So all attendants are muted throughout. There is a Q&A tool. So if you do have any questions as we go through, please use the Q&A tool and we'll get to them at the end. The session is due to last roughly an hour. There will be a brief presentation and then quite a long Q&A with today's panel. The webinar is being recorded and we'll circulate that after today's session. Just to give you an introduction to today's speakers. So we have Ian Allen, Head of Market Strategy at Switch2, Rihanna Wilshire, Partner at Freeths, Kathy Olphin, Sustainability Manager at Switch2, and we're waiting on Stephen Knight to join us, Chief Executive at Heat Trust. So I'll just hand you over now to, I believe Kathy is taking us through the first session. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. So just to sort of give you a bearing in sort of where this webinar is taking place. This is the third in a series of webinars on regulation. If you haven't caught any of the previous webinars, they're available to view online. So I'd highly recommend having a watch through. And then, of course, this webinar as well will be available to view online after the session. So really recommend having a look through. So I just wanted to give a very brief introduction to HINTAS to make sure everyone's sort of on the same page with some sort of overall context before we dig into sort of some of the panel discussion. So HINTAS, fundamentally, its aim is to deliver a heat network technical assurance scheme that ensures a minimum level of performance and reliability for heat networks in the UK. We all know that heat networks are of a very diverse range of performance, but there are many heat networks across the country that aren't performing to a standard that we'd hope they would. So this is sort of the fundamental aim of HINTAS, is to make sure we've got a minimum standard across the UK. It's got some key core principles in place. So it's designed to be outcomes oriented, it's meant to be preventative, proportionate, adaptable, deliverable, and fundamentally enforceable. So sort of really moving away from some of the other more voluntary certification schemes that we've seen in the past. So in terms of the timeline of HINTAS, in July we had sort of the first key documentation on HINTAS release. That was the overview, draft assessment procedures and technical specifications. So that's given us a lot to sort of sink our teeth into in the meantime. Last month we saw TS1 released. So this is sort of much more detail on the new build process in particular. It goes hand in hand with the MMS, the metering and monitoring standards. We haven't seen that yet. We're hoping it'll be in December 2025, might even be this week. So hoping it'll come by Christmas. In terms of official statements on timelines for HINTAS, the latest official statement was that we'd expect to have a consultation in autumn 2025. Of course, we haven't had anything as yet, but hopefully any day now. And the idea being that we would have a response from HINTAS in spring 2026 with anticipation to go live in autumn 2026. Now, of course, consultation has been quite significantly delayed. We were initially expecting it in the first half of this year. So whether or not those timeframes are still achievable remains to be seen, but that's sort of the official line. It's really important to caveat this entire webinar and everything being discussed about HINTAS is that it still hasn't gone through consultation. So everything is subject to change when it comes to HINTAS in general. So the way that HINTAS works is it's designed to be modular. So what they've done is they've divided a heat network into 6 individual components, which they call elements. So you've got your energy centre, your district distribution network, communal distribution network, substation, customer connection, which for many would be the sort of HRU, and the customer heat system. Now, it's designed to be modular because it's appreciated that some networks are more complicated than others. So you might be looking at this and thinking that you don't have a substation or a district distribution network within your schemes. And that's completely understandable. You, of course, would not be expected to comply with components that aren't present within your network. It's appreciated that parts of networks might fall under different jurisdictions, particularly when we're looking at sort of more large-scale district distribution. And also is designed so that if you're adding specific elements to existing schemes, only those elements that you're adding would be considered sort of new build components. You wouldn't be expected to certify the entire network as new build. So there's definitely a modular component built up, and you would be certifying each element separately. Now, which pathway you go down for HINTAS depends on how you're categorized at the time of HINTAS launch. So if you go down the existing assurance pathway, that's because you are in operation at that time that HINTAS launches. Currently, sort of the latest statement is that'll be autumn 2026. It might be later based on delays. If you are in the design or construction phases at the time of HINTAS launch, you would be considered a pre-operation network and go down the pre-operation pathway. We'll give a bit more detail on what these pathways look like later slides. And if you have not yet started design or construction at the time of HINTAS launch, you would be registering and certifying as a new build network from the get-go. Thank you very much. So if you are depending on how you're categorized at the time of scheme launch, that would affect your assurance pathway. So if you're an existing network, you would go down the existing assurance pathway, and you would certify and go through your ongoing requirements. If you're a new build network, you would be going through the new build assurance pathway, obviously certifying. If you're an existing network fundamentally that isn't able to go through the existing assurance pathway, you would be certifying as an end-of-life network, registering end-of-life, and then you would go through the new build phase for at least that component that wasn't able to pass through the existing assurance pathway. Now, if you're in the design and construction phase, you would be entering as a pre-operation network. So depending on whether you sort of go through the existing or the new build assurance pathway for each component of your scheme, we need a little bit more detail on that. We haven't got the clarity on exactly where you would go at each stage, but it's assumed that depending on which stage you're in of design and construction would influence how you would be proceeding down the pathway for that component of your network, that element. Next slide, please. So the pathway, this is the new build pathway that you would be looking through. So they have phases that are broadly aligned with the REBA stages. And for each phase to progress to the next stage, you go through what's called a gateway. So there are 4 gateways within the new build HINTAS pathway. There are 2 clear certification points at gateways 3 and 4. So you have certification point 1 to enter into your initial stage of operation. And then after 2 years of operation, you were able to certify your second certification point. So that means that you can demonstrate that your network has been performing to sort of your desired standard for 2 years. And so demonstrate sort of long-term consistency. Once you've gone through your 2 certification points, you would be considered sort of an ongoing network. So you would be out of the assessment phase and move into the ongoing phase, and you would just be reporting and sort of going on with your ongoing maintenance as a network. There are various different areas where you're expected to pass assessment points, and I won't go into the detail on those specific assessment points because I don't want to dig in too much, but there are various assessment points to progress through each gateway, and they would be assessed by a licensed assessor. Now, if you are an existing network, which we're assuming sort of many of the people on this call today will be interested in finding out more about, you have a timeframes and assurance pathway that's slightly different depending on whether or not you were already expected to comply with the heat network metering and billing regulations. So there are some fundamental differences between the timescales for those that are expected to comply and those that aren't expected to comply. In both instances, you're expected to register your heat network in year 1, and that's year 1 following HINTAS launch. So all of this is in relation to that launch date, which obviously is not yet defined. In year 3, if you are already expected to comply with heat network metering and billing regulations, you should be able to demonstrate your meeting your minimum metering and monitoring requirements, and that you're also able to meet your threshold performance KPIs. And at that stage, you would be submitting your heat network improvement plan. You would sort of undergo that improvement plan to the point that hopefully in year 6 following HINTAS launch, you are able to demonstrate and submit all of your KPIs to certify with certification point 1. And after 2 years where you can demonstrate that you've been performing to those KPIs, you will be certified in year 8 of HINTAS with your certification point 2. Following that, you would go into the ongoing phase and sort of have completed your assessment phase for HINTAS. Now, if you're not yet required to comply with heat network metering and billing regulations, you are afforded a bit of a grace period to get your metering that isn't already required up to scratch. So what you have is you would still be expected to register in year 1. In year 3, you would be expected to demonstrate meeting your minimum metering and monitoring requirements and your threshold performance KPIs. Given an extra year to submit your heat network improvement plan, so you'd be given up until year 4 to do that. And you would have up until the end of year 5 to sort of have all of your end user metering and monitoring in place. Then from there, you have 2 years before year 8, where you will be expected to certify to your certification point 1, and then following 2 years of performance at that level, you would be certifying in year 10 at certification point 2. So that gives a rough idea of timeframes from the point of launch. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if you're on the end of life pathway, so fundamentally, if at that 3-point mark where you're expected to meet your threshold KPIs, you're unable to meet those threshold KPIs, instead of going through the existing assurance pathway, you would instead cycle back round as an end of life network. And what you'd be expected to do is go back to the design phase of your build and re-register effectively, going as partly through the new build phase to do this. So you'd register in year 1. In year 3, after not meeting the threshold KPIs, you declare an end-of-life network. In year 5, you would be expected to have a statement of conformity to progress through phase 3. And then you would be expected to certify with a network that's performing to standard in year 8. And after 2 years of demonstrating that performance, you would get your certification level 2. To be clear, there's not a huge amount of clarity at the moment on the existing and end-of-life phases. Most of the documentation provided so far has been new build. So this is pretty much all of the detail we currently have of the end-of-life pathway. Hopefully more detail will be provided soon, but that's currently all we have. So when it comes to KPIs, we have seen what the KPIs are for new build, obviously subject to consultation. What we know is that new build and existing networks will be expected to report to the same metrics, to the same fundamental KPIs. The level at which they're expected to be assessed against is not clear. So we have an idea for new build networks of sort of fundamental threshold to pass. It's hoped that that threshold obviously would be lower for an existing network. You wouldn't be expected to achieve to the same standard necessarily as a new build network for an older scheme, but those aren't yet defined. So hopefully something that will have more clarity in future. Overall, in the draft specification, 73 KPIs were listed in total. Of those, 64 were considered assessed metrics rather than reported metrics. So there is a pass or fail component to those, and 57 of those require monthly reporting in order to meet the KPIs requirements. So there is quite a high level of KPI submissions and monitoring and metering associated with HINTAS in its current state, obviously subject to consultation. And we have sort of some fundamental take-homes from today, which I'm hoping that the panel discussion will feed back on, but we really wanted to draw attention to 5 things that you can do today to help prepare for HINTAS. So it's with I know there's a lot up in the air, we're not fully sure on some of the details, but fundamentally there are some no regrets actions that we would recommend almost every heat network operator or owner to do. So first of all, if you haven't already, complete a HNES optimization study on your networks. It's fully funded and it gives you a really clear insight into sort of what's performing well on your network and the key areas you can do to improve your performance in the long run. If you haven't already, make sure that you have a specialist O&M contractor that has optimization sort of at the core of what it does to deliver. Switch to, of course, our specialist O&M contractor, and we do hold optimization and really put performance at the forefront of how we administer maintenance on our schemes. If you haven't already, and this is such an easy one to do, get automatic meter reading on your gas meter. So this is an AMR device that gets installed on your gas meter that makes sure that you get automated meter reads coming through. It's really surprising the number of schemes that are using estimated reads to calculate tariffs or to sort of estimate costs. And that's really, really important that you're making sure that those are accurate so you have a good idea. It's almost definitely going to be required as part of HINTAS. It's looking like it's going to be really clear part of your cost reporting for other parts of regulation. So sort of a real no regret solution there. And we've got a solution in place that's just over £100 a year. So come and speak to us if you're interested in that. An area that's really often forgotten about but really important is to check your network's water quality. So water quality is something that can have sort of a real impact across the network, so leading to corrosion and potential leaks across your pipework. And it's something that can be done early on, and you wouldn't regret doing it in the long run. And fundamentally, we really want to call everyone your key stakeholders within heat networks. And it's really important that you respond to upcoming consultation, no matter what your thoughts are, or sort of whether you feel like you're qualified. Your voice is important and needs to be heard on HINTAS consultation. So we'd really recommend and encourage anyone who wants to respond to the upcoming consultation on HINTAS to make sure that it's delivering something that is useful and impactful for the entire industry. Yeah, without further ado, I'll move over to the panel discussion with Rhianna.
Thanks ever so much, Kathy. That was super, super helpful introduction to it. I do appreciate it's a little bit difficult at the moment because in the run up to Christmas, we are receiving documents coming from DESNZ all the time. Just yesterday at midday, we had some of the draft code documents arrive for new builds. And so we've got the technical specs and the assessment procedures, and we're anticipating, like you said, the technical standards consultations and the metering and monitoring information to be passed through as well in the next week, potentially today, but potentially before Christmas. So some of this may well be subject to change, which may lead us to have to do another session coming out of this in January as a follow-up. But we can talk about that later. So we're moving on to the panel section now of the webinar. And I want to say a big thank you to everybody who, when registering, submitted all of the questions that we've had. We've had a page and a half's worth of questions that have come into us. So thanks everyone for those. I've tried to group them together so that we can do them by theme. Otherwise, we risk jumping around quite a lot. If you do have questions as you go through, please put them into the Q&A and we'll come to them as we go along. But for now, the first one I wanted to kick off with was, what is the need for HENTAS? Why do we need to improve our technical standards in new build residential heat networks, and I suppose in existing as well? And linked to that, bit of a two-parter, how does that interface with the consumer protection regulations that's also being launched at the moment? I'm going to put that over to both Stephen and Alan to answer in the first instance, please.
Well, good morning, everybody. Stephen Knight here from Heat Trust. Nice to join the webinar this morning. I think it's fundamental to this issue of technical standards is why are we doing it, right? And I think the experience that we've had as a consumer champion in the heat network sector for the last decade is that far too many, sadly, heat networks are not performing brilliantly. We haven't had any mandatory technical standards in place, so there's been no kind of standards that heat networks have had to be built, and expertise is not always in the construction sector being great in terms of getting things right. So what has that led to in terms of consumer detriment? I guess up until the energy crisis a few years ago, the biggest consumer detriment we tended to hear about was overheating corridors and really unpleasantly hot in buildings sometimes in the summer. And we used to also hear about issues around lots of interruptions to supply and outages, far too frequent. Those things continue to happen. But what we found in the energy crisis was that actually the poor performance came out in terms of very high bills. And that's because a lot of heat was being lost in poorly performing heat networks between the heat source, typically a gas boiler, and the end consumer. And what that meant was, with gas prices being high, and in many cases, most of the heat generated by that gas being lost in transport between the gas boiler and the home, the consumer was ending up with paying very large tariff bills for heating as a result of that, because they were paying for lots of heat that they weren't actually receiving. And so I think I think this has kind of highlighted, if you like, a problem that a lot of heat networks are performing very poorly. And, we do see in the sector heat networks that are performing at something like 35% efficiency, which is obviously not good enough in terms of, wasted gas, carbon dioxide emissions and everything else. And it's certainly not good enough in terms of consumer outcomes when they're paying, vastly more for their heat than if they had their own gas boiler. And so I think as part of the regulatory package to protect consumers, a key part of making sure consumers get a good outcome from being on a heat network is ensuring that the heat networks are built, installed, commissioned, maintained, and operated in an efficient way and a reliable way, so that people get reliable, efficient heat at a reasonable cost. And fundamentally, that's what most consumers want. And so that's such a really important part, of the regulatory landscape, and that's why HENTAS is there. And it's why it's going to have to be fairly rigorous to start with until we've got sectoral, better performance across the sector in terms of getting heat networks, to a much better place. And they should be. And the best ones out there, we see evidence of this. The best heat networks out there very rarely fall over and are efficient and with low heat losses. So it can be done. And I think the idea of HENTAS, is to make sure that every heat network out there performs at that, basic minimum standard of a good performing modern heat network.
Thanks, Steve. I think, yeah. I mean, we saw the improvement in standards starting in 2015 or just before with the introduction of CP1. And we're very supportive of the need to improve standards on heat networks. So we thought in 2015 when CP1, which is the CIBSE Code of Practice for heat networks, when that was launched, that we would see an improvement in the standard of heat networks. Unfortunately, we didn't, and we're still seeing heat networks delivered with, I suppose I would put them as basic problems with heat networks, not enough insulation, not enough, designs which aren't optimized. So we see too many cookie cutter out designs rather than them being adapted to improve. And we do reviews of networks that we are going to adopt, and we see problems and we go feed these problems back. And of course, it's too late in the development cycle to make changes. So we see those problems, but we also see problems in maintenance as well. I've seen pictures recently of newly delivered buildings, and it's obvious there's no water treatment. There's the equipment in to do the water treatment, but it looks as though it's never been used. So there are also problems with the maintenance of heat networks, and the sector isn't yet really good at maintaining heat networks. I think there's a lot of buildings who are using contractors who don't really understand how heat networks should work, don't understand the importance of water treatment, for example, importance of insulation, the importance of even sorting out the building energy management system, the system that controls the boilers, sorting out the right programs on those. So you have things like night setback. So there's some really easy things, what you would have thought should be easy things to put right. So as we see it, there is a lot that the industry needs to do to improve both the design and delivery of heat networks. And all of this, of course, was said in CP1, the HNTAS, which is based on CP1, the Code of Practice, hasn't got that many changes in. There are some, bringing it up to date changes, but basically all that has been out there for at least the last 10 years on how to do it properly. And the problem is that still people haven't been doing it properly. So I think this HNTAS is a reaction to that, really. So it's definitely needed. Yeah.
Thanks both. And the interface with consumer protection, I think, as Stephen already touched upon, is that the more efficient, better run systems should ultimately relate to lower costs for consumers, because they shouldn't be spending so much money on their heating bills. And that's why there's such an interrelationship between the consumer protection regulation that's coming in and HENTAS. They kind of work hand in hand. So you touched, Ian, on the CP1 and CIBSE CP1 Code of Practice, which will translate into the technical standards TS1. You've already kind of alluded to there not being too many departures from that, but what are the most significant departures do you see between the two?
So just on the customer protection thing, that it's not just the losses on the heat network which cause higher prices, it's the premature failure of equipment and having to replace plant and equipment because it hasn't been managed or properly. For example, boilers that cycle because the programs in the BEM system aren't working properly, or there's some problems with the way it's configured. The boiler's cycling too often, and that brings down the life of those boilers, for example. So we've seen boilers that have only lasted 6 years, when they're supposed to be lasting 30 years. So it's not just the heat losses, but it's the cost of premature failure and maintenance visits. In CP1, the main difference in CP1 is over CP1 is the HNTAS is putting in a regime of assessment and gateways and requirements for metering and monitoring and submitting the results, whereas CP1, of course, was just a code of practice with no obligation to prove that you've actually delivered to CP1. The HNTAS is the main changes are around the gateways and the assessments and having to prove that you've delivered, and at each stage prove that you've delivered to CP1. And I suppose our worry is the cost of doing that, and we don't fully understand the cost, how much it's going to delay the build program. So we've got some concerns around that, but that's the main difference.
Great, thank you. Just turning to scope then. And we've talked already about the relationship with the consumer protection, and we've got new rules under those regulations about suppliers and operators. So who is it that's going to have to be the responsible person under HNTAS?
I think it depends on the stage. So I think when Kathy was talking about stages earlier, so if you're in design stage, then it's going to be the designer or the organisation that's doing the design is going to be the responsible person, or in construction and so on. So I think it's at the point at which you're in operation and your heat network is being assessed in terms of its operation. And at that point, if it's a new build, it will have been certified at the point of commissioning that it's operating effectively. But beyond that, I think it becomes the operators will no doubt be the responsible person. And because there's a stage 2 years down the road that sort of gives you that second certification that it's still operating efficiently and effectively, and everything is still going well. Because I think there's obviously a concern that you can build a network as perfectly as you like, but if no one does any maintenance, as soon as it's handed over, then it's very quickly going to fall into disarray. So the scheme has this, as was said earlier, design, build, construction, commissioning, and then an operation phase. And that operation phase has to be assessed as well. And at that stage, yes, if you're the operator, then no doubt you will be the one on the hook to providing the monitoring data to HNTAS, and there'll be a lot of monitoring data being provided, I think, almost in real time, some of it. They'll be checking those KPIs and ongoing performance. But before that, obviously, it won't necessarily be the same organisation that's building it.
Yeah. And I would say, of course, one of the problems that we see at the moment is the trend for design and build, where we see a lot of clients who have some very good ambitions for their heat networks, but then the building is put out to a design and build contractor, and the golden thread of those initial high ideals for the heat network then get diluted in the design and build process, because the contractor who really only the design and build contractor who really has no interest in the ongoing operation of the system will make decisions when they take the initial design, the initial high level design, and they may well make decisions which conflict with those original high ideals for the heat network and deliver something that perhaps didn't look like the initial requirement for the heat network. And of course, the process of the gateways and the assessments of each one as it's handed over will stop that. So we're sort of implementing the idea of a golden thread, which means that the organisation that commissioned the heat network, their ideals or their requirements will be passed through the different phases, which is really what we need to get to, and certainly. And that's a similar idea to the Building Safety Act, which is introducing on other parts of construction, such as the fire safety and structural safety, where they're implementing this golden thread idea. And the operation at the moment in HANS is 2 years, a 2 years assessment, which you have to prove that it's being operated to the required standards. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Linked to this, and I suppose this is the tail end of the question, really, one of the questions that's come in through the registration process was, would the operator of the system for the regulatory purposes be the site owner or the leaseholder or a management company? And I think we need to look back at our previous webinars and the consumer protection regulation as to who the operator might be. And it really is the person who is in charge of the network day to day and is empowered to make investment decisions in that network and take risk in the network. So although you may have the landlord, or you may be the landlord, residential landlord, if you have somebody who's coming in and taking the risk in that and able to make those investment decisions, and then you can transfer that regulatory role of operator onto that third party, saying an ESCO. You have to be quite difficult where you've got just service provider on a fee-for-service basis who are doing short-term O&M contracts, because the likelihood is that you wouldn't pass that regulatory burden over to them. The role of operator would probably still stay with the landlord as the person who has the kind of investment decisions and risk-taking around the network. So I just wanted to lump those two questions together. Thank you for that. So one of the questions that's come in as well is, if my heat network's giving value for money at the moment and it's working reliably, do I really have to have it assessed?
Great question. And that's definitely one for the consultation to feed back into the consultation. That is a very good question. And it appears to me that HNTAS states its ambition to be outcome orientated, but on the other hand, it's incredibly prescriptive about what you have to do, to how you have to do it. So I think that is a really good question, and it will be interesting to see how much flexibility there is going to be for a more outcome orientated approach. But yeah, and I suppose we are going to encourage you all to look at this consultation when it comes out. And I think it's 12 o'clock today has been slated as the time it comes out. So immediately after this webinar. Yeah, so that is a really good question. And that's a question I have as well. How much flexibility there is if you're delivering the right outcomes, but you're not putting in the required level of metering, or you haven't done something in the way that the CIPSI CP1 or the HNTAS TS1s requires you to do. What will be the outcome? Don't know, Stephen, your views on that?
Yeah, I think the existing networks pathway is very much about, as Ian said, outcomes focused. So it's very much about, are you meeting the performance KPI thresholds? So if you could demonstrate that your network is already meeting all those thresholds, then other than providing the evidence and the monitoring data to show that your network is meeting those performance thresholds, you shouldn't have to do anything else. I think that's certainly the theory behind it. Obviously, we need to see the detail, but I think, even if your network is performing, you think your network's performing well, I guess you've got to provide that reassurance to HNTAS in terms of monitoring data to demonstrate it, evidence that your network is performing well. And that might require you to adding some monitoring points, some extra meters or something in order to make sure that you can demonstrate that in terms of all the KPIs. But fundamentally, yeah, if your network's performing well, you shouldn't have to do anything because you're already meeting the KPIs. Fine. I mean, you might think it's performing well, but it might not be performing as well as you think it is. So, I think you will have to go through that process of evidencing and demonstrating that it is performing as well as you think it's performing, and it is hitting the thresholds.
The proof, to me, the actual measurement of that is the customer protection measurements, because you're going to have to provide Ofgem from next year with the amount of gas or energy that's going into the heat network and how many times it breaks down. And ultimately, if you are putting an amount of gas in, which is providing heat at a reasonable cost, and it's not breaking down, then you are potentially meeting that requirement. So if you're not, then it would be obvious that you would have a high tariff, or you would be putting too much gas in for the number of properties that you have. You would be in the top 10 percentile, which Ofgem look at, and you would be breaking down. You would be having too many breakdowns, and that's really that's the cookie crumbles around those two measures. I think. So it's about cost and it's about reliability, and if you believe that you're demonstrating that to Ofgem, then I question what more's needed than that. If you can do that, what do you think, Stephen?
Well, as I say, I don't think if anyone's got a really good performing network right now that's doing all of those things, then it shouldn't be difficult to evidence you're hitting all the KPIs. So it really shouldn't be a problem. I think the more tricky problem is going to be those heat networks that fundamentally are not achieving those outcomes, and where remediation is going to be required. And the thorny issue there comes into how that's going to be delivered and how it's going to be paid for and how much can be delivered in given the restraints of the site and all the rest of it. That's a much more difficult problem. If you've got a heat network that's performing well and efficiently and reliably, it's just a question of evidencing that with data. That shouldn't really be beyond the wit of any operator to get right, I think.
And I suppose the immediate way to move towards that is by two things that Kathy said in her presentation. One is making sure your maintenance is done properly, and making sure that you've got your gas meter readings and you've got those reliably and robustly. And once you've got those, you've got the if you can't, then you stand the best chance of delivering a reliable network and at the right cost with what you have already.
And at the very least, understanding the efficiency and performance of your network, because actually, if you don't have a reliable data on how much gas you're using, for instance, then you're not going to know how efficient your network is performing. You're not going to, you can't actually judge how well it's performing unless you know how much energy it's consuming, obviously. So, let's get these basics right. And then I think one of the key things that Hentas will do is everyone is going to have a good understanding of how well their network is performing. And at the moment, sadly, far too many operators just don't know how well their network is performing. They just don't have the evidence, the data to support those kind of judgments. Yeah.
I think that lets us segue really nicely into the next question we had, actually, which was one for Kathy, which is the metering and monitoring spec hasn't yet been published, although we are led to believe that it will be very, very soon, perhaps today. So how important is metering and monitoring for heat networks? So we've touched on this already, but Kathy, if you wanted to come in on that.
Yes. I just, to me, it's sort of that critical first step in terms of understanding your heat network optimization. So if you don't, like Stephen said, if you don't know how much energy is going into your system, how can you tell it's performing right? If you're not metering at various stages of your network, where can you see where your losses are? How can you tell where it's performing? So I would always say you can't make an informed decision without having that critical data at each stage of the network and understanding where your losses are. So I think metering is often a really sort of unsung hero when it comes to optimization, and it's often sort of a really critical first step. So regardless of HINTAS, we would always say the more metering you have across your network, the better informed view you can have of where it's performing, and you can make more informed decisions in terms of where to invest in your network and how to improve. So it's to me anyway, it's always a no regret solution, particularly when we have solutions like gas AMR that are such low cost interventions. It's always worth doing.
Thank you. And one of the questions that's coming from Andra on the Q&A live is how can you demonstrate that you're meeting those minimum metering and monitoring requirements given you're expected to submit values and KPIs in years 5 and 6? Do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I assume that's relating to those that are exempt currently from heat network metering and billing regulations. There is a bit of a sort of slight confusing element where you're expecting to demonstrate you're meeting those threshold KPIs in year 3, but you're not expected to have end user metering until year 5. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more clarity on that, because obviously some of those KPIs would require end user metering in order to submit that you're performing or not to those KPIs. So I agree, it's a bit of a confusing point, a bit of a it doesn't fully make sense. Hopefully we'll get more clarity on that when consultation's released.
Yeah, I think everyone should be aware that final customer metering is really important, because we see regularly where we install meters into heat networks, we see at least a 35% reduction in gas, and we see regularly 50% halving the gas consumption, because people start using their controls, turning it off when they go out, and closing their windows. So it has a massive implication on the usage. The problem is that some heat networks will be ladder systems and single pipe systems where you can't fit a traditional heat meter, and I'm yet to understand what the solution is going to be for those type of systems where it is difficult or impossible to install a traditional heat meter. That's something I don't fully understand what the government's intentions are at this stage.
I think those are going to be the tricky ones, aren't they? But one thing I just think it's worth adding is that that there's a certain level of metering that has been required for some years now under the metering and billing regs, which is building level meters. And, I've heard quite a lot of operators saying that they've not actually got building level meters in place. Well, it has been required, I think, for the last decade. And I think the assumption will be by HENTAS and Ofgem that you've got these. So if you haven't got them, get them in place now. Because I'm aware there are there's that certain level of building meters, will be part of demonstrating your performance, particularly if you haven't got end consumer meters.
And to put it into context, the ladder system with no metering and poor controls will be using in the region of 20,000 kilowatt hours or more gas per apartment, per dwelling. Whereas if you put metering in a modern system, we see down as way below 10,000. So it is a massive. You are talking about thousands of kilowatt hours per year per apartment being saved. As I say, reducing from 20 in the region of 20,000 down to under 10,000 just by having proper meters and controls. And I'm not sure that the quantum of that difference is fully understood in this country generally.
And we do know that more the regulations will require more buildings to have end user heat meters. Mm-hmm. If you remember, the current regulations split buildings up into 3 different classes, and the kind of viable, open, and exempt class. that open class where you could do a financial assessment to see whether or not it was viable to fit meters, that open class is going. We know that. That's already, the legislation for that has already been published. So there won't be any of this, it's not financially viable to fit end users. There will still be exemptions from end user metering. But I think very much the push is going to be to get more end user meters into existing heat networks. And that is going to be an expectation, I think, of regulation for all the reasons that Ian set out.
And just to tie up the metering, because metering is one of the key themes that's come through in a number of questions. And we've had 3 very similar questions about existing networks and what the timescales might be for compliance with all of the metering requirements. And do we have an idea of the timescales for compliance on existing buildings at the moment?
Yes, so it's looking currently like it'll be in year 3 from HINTAS launch is sort of what we've heard, obviously with a sort of year 5 grace period for end user metering for those that aren't currently complying with heat network metering and billing regulations are expected to comply with those regulations. So yeah, it's that 3-year mark is quite a critical time frame where you're expected to meet your minimum metering and monitoring thresholds.
Yeah. And so another one of the key themes that's come out through the questions in registration and the ones that are coming through on the Q&A at the moment, I suppose is the elephant in the room, and that's how is the cost going to be passed? How is it going to be managed? How is it possible for it to be passed on to residents or not? What do we need to be thinking about when we're passing through costs? What costs can be shouldered? So there's an awful number of questions. So I'm going to try and kind of put them together. But I think one of them, in fact, is that lawyers need to be better versed at making sure that leases can allow those types of capital investment costs to be passed through to residents. As a lawyer, I don't dispute that. I'm not a real estate lawyer, but I do look at leases from time to time. And I think that really pulls together quite nicely the issue we've got with passing through costs, because there's not going to be, as I understand it, the statutory ability to pass these costs through. So we have to look back to kind of landlord and tenant law with what costs are reasonable under sections 18 to 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act. So you have to make sure that those costs are reasonably incurred and reasonably procured as well through the consultation process over certain thresholds. And then we really need to look at how those costs are recovered from customers, whether it's done through a customer supply agreement and how those tariffs are calculated. Or it could be that if you don't have a customer supply agreement, those charges are recovered through leases, through service charge, and really have to look at the devil in the detail as to whether that lease entitles you to go in above just the kind of regular operation and maintenance costs into life cycle replacement, capital plant replacement, renewals, that type of language, as to whether those costs can be passed through. Now, there's obviously a legal routes for being able to pass those costs through, but there's also the question of should they be passed through? Should landlords be shouldering those costs? Will there be organisations like that, local authorities and registered providers who prefer to shoulder those costs, or prefer to put some of that cost through? It might be that you don't have headroom on your tariffs and service charges to be able to put that through if they're already high already. So I'm just going to put the question out to all of the panellists in the elephant in the room and how we recover those costs.
I suppose from my point of view, there's 2 things to think about here. One is that if you're improving the operation of a heat network, you should be saving gas. And so there should be a payback on improving your heat networks. And I think we need to be a bit more nuanced in how we share or how that payback is apportioned, in the tariff, how it's recognised that there are costs involved in improving your heat network, and they need to be fed into the tariffs, and it should bring the tariffs down. Certainly, the payback on installing final customer meters, for example, is potentially under a year for installing. But at the moment we have no mechanisms for feeding that payback back into tariffs and funding it through the tariff system in a reasonable way. And so I feel there needs to be more guidance on how these paybacks how the costs should be taken into account in tariffs and over what period of time. And I think we need to be better at understanding the benefits of improving the heat networks so we can actually see the reduction in costs and balance that with the costs of the capital for doing the improvements. And of course, maintenance as well. Better maintenance will cost more, but it should pay for itself. So we need to build more evidence around the payback on these activities.
I think you're right. This is the elephant in the room, and for me, it's the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues out there in terms of how these new regulations will either help consumers or not help consumers. Because, fundamentally, if the regulations require a really poor heat network to be improved, that heat network is not delivering for consumers at the moment. So yes, it needs to be improved. But is it the consumers that should have to pay for that themselves through very large service charges if they're leaseholders, for instance, that they've not budgeted for and they've not got, in place to or any ability to do. And fundamentally, if you suddenly ask leaseholders for large sums to do work, they're not going to be able to afford it, and therefore the work isn't going to happen, all the rest of it. So achieving it is going to be quite difficult. I think certainly we as Heat Trust have been saying to government for a little while now that they need an answer to this question. How is it going to be funded? How are leaseholders in particular going to be protected from very large bills? And to some extent, government have tried to do this over cladding by pushing some of the costs back on to the developer that built systems. And I think that's probably part of the answer with heat networks as well. The advantage for heat networks, as Ian said, is, there was no payback for removing cladding. That was just a cost, but there will be a saving from making your heat network efficient. So there is that benefit. But I appreciate, as somebody, I spent 20 years as a councillor in a previous life, and I appreciate local authorities do not have spare capital sitting around for this kind of thing, and neither do housing associations for that matter. If you don't have the ability, if you've got regulated rents, if you're a social landlord, to put rents up to pay for this, you don't necessarily have the capital sitting around. So how are you going to pay for it? So I think, as I say, government, I think, needs to answer fundamentally these problems. They probably are going to have to put some more money in, particularly in the social landlord sector, I suspect, to pay for some of this. And I think they probably need to make some of those very large house builders that built some of these systems in the first place that are performing inadequately, put their hand into their pocket and pay for some of the work as well. But that probably doesn't help us if your system's 50 years old. So yeah, I think it is the big elephant, and we do need answers, but they're not simple. But right, there is a HENTAS, there is a HNES. Sorry, get my initials right. There is an HNES system in place. Let's come back to that. That will, as well as funding, an optimization study for your heat network, will pay 50% of capital remediation costs. Now, I think, as somebody said in one of the questions, is this massively oversubscribed and big waiting list? Right now, no, it isn't. Right, but it will be very soon. I can guarantee it will be very soon. So get your applications in right now for that money. Don't wait. That's what I would say.
It's interesting because we're seeing some, good success stories with HNES. But in the private sector, we're definitely seeing evidence that even with 50% funding, the leaseholders aren't able to or unwilling to, you can't get a consensus with the leaseholders to fund the match funding, the 50%, and that is a problem. And I think, from my point of view, what I would like to see is the government bringing in or facilitating finance, low interest finance that the building owners can draw down on and pay back over a reasonable period of time, and then some of that can then be paid back in the savings that the residents are going to make. There's always been a disconnect in heat networks between who pays for the work and who benefits from the work. There's always been that disconnect. It's always the building owners that pay for the work, but they don't see the benefits because it's the residents, it's the tenants in the building that sees the work, and I think that balance needs to be sorted out. We need to get better at sorting that balance out. So I would like to see the government bringing in or facilitating a fund that you can draw down on and pay back over a longer period of time, and make it, sort of, especially in the private sector, because the private sector is struggling. Most of the HS&S capital we're seeing in the public sector at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. One of the questions David Robbins has put into the chat is, so how are tenants protected from remedial costs? And I think the bottom line is there isn't anything through the Hentas consultations that I've seen that will protect that cost from being passed through. So we do have to look back at housing legislation in terms of what can be recharged through service charges, etc., and Landlord and Tenant Act. And as well, under the consumer protection regulation, we've obviously got the fair pricing regime as well that will look at making sure that it's done on a cost basis. But that doesn't necessarily cap or in any way say that it can only put certain costs through. It's just that the price that's paid by customers has to be fair. So if you're trying to push it through a tariff and the tariff was going through the roof, then the question mark would be around whether that fair pricing principle has been complied with. But other than that, I don't think there are any other kind of protections really from tenants on remedial costs coming through. So in the last 4 minutes that we've got, I just wanted to touch on the gateways and assessment processes. One of the questions that's come through are, what are your views on the gateways and assessment processes? Quite an open question, but if you've got any particular views on the process that's going to have to be followed.
Who wants to start? Shall I start?
Yeah, who wants to go first? You go, Ian.
I love. I obviously the sentiment is right, and we do need to improve heat networks. But I am worried about the cost and the delay in the program, and we've already seen it with the Building Safety Act and the gateways and assessment that they put in for high-rise buildings, and we've always seen a massive slowdown in the delivery of buildings because of this assessment, not having enough assessors, not being able to go through the process. And I worry that the same thing would happen in heat networks. So I'm worried about the cost, and I'm worried about the risk it puts on the build out program, and I worry that will put developers off selecting heat networks as their choice of heating for their buildings. So that's my worry. What have I got a solution for it? My solution would be to put more focus on accountability, because when we see now buildings that are delivered with problems, we still don't see them getting fixed, and we don't see the people who haven't done their job properly being taken to task. So we see a lack of accountability, and maybe I worry that we're going to go too far into the gateway and assessment rather than focusing on accountability when things go wrong. But that's my view anyway. Stephen, I'm sure, and Kathy, I'm sure you've got reviews as well. Yeah.
Well, I was just about to say, we're in the last minute or so of the webinar. Is there any themes that any of the panelists think that we haven't managed to touch upon that we just want to draw out on quickly? Any burning desires to make any comments in relation to anything we've discussed already or that we haven't covered?
I would just very quickly jump in and encourage again to respond to consultation. As Ian says, there are sort of some potential concerns about delays and costs associated that I'm sure you guys will be sort of thinking about as well. If you do have any concerns, if you do have any queries, if you're not sure if you're supporting specific elements, it's really important that you sort of have your say. That's what the consultation process is for. If there are certain elements that you feel are overly complex or perhaps not meeting or covering areas that you feel should be, that's really important that you have your say in consultation. So I think that's just what I'd like to touch on again, is that it's opening hopefully soon. We really encourage you to have your say.
I agree with that. Respond to the consultation when it comes. I mean, I'm encouraged to hear it might be coming today, but I'll wait and see. I think, fundamentally try and do what you can now, because there are no regrets in improving your heat network actually in terms of its performance, because, you will have happier customers if you can do that now, whether or not a Hentaz is there in place to make you do it. And if your heat network is performing well, then, get yourself the data to be able to prove that to yourself and to your customers and to Hentaz. And you'll be in a very strong position when these regulations do arrive. And I think part of that will be about applying for that HNES funding to get an optimization study, and find out really how good your heat network really is. If you think it's good, get it studied and make sure that that is evidenced. And, that's what we want. We all want heat networks that are performing well, reliably, and efficiently, and delivering, low cost, reliable heat to customers. And you've got lots of happy customers. That's ultimately what it's all about, isn't it?
Absolutely. Ian, have you got any last thoughts?
And I would add to that: review your maintenance of your heat networks. Decide on the standard of maintenance that you want on your heat networks, and really think about maintenance, because you can do an awful lot of improvement with better maintenance, or a better approach to maintenance. I would say, and one of my concerns a little bit around HNES at the moment is that the benchmark for paybacks is being calculated before proper maintenance has been, or improvements in maintenance have been taken place.
Great, thank you, everyone. I think that probably brings us to a close. We are 2 minutes over time. So thank you, everyone, for coming and for dialing in.
I suppose watch this space, because I think we're talking about doing another webinar in the new year when we've had a chance to look at the consultation, and we would be very happy to share our thoughts and perhaps point you in the direction of some of the questions you should, because in these consultations you don't have to answer all the questions. And there are things you should do when you respond to them, like if you've got any problems, answer no, but I agree with no, but I agree with this, but not with this bit, rather than say yes, but I disagree with this little bit, because so we'd be happy to give you some thoughts on those, and perhaps do that. So we'll put something together for that, I think. Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks, everybody.